UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has urged governments to end what he calls an orgy of destruction as a biodiversity summit kicks off in Canada. At its opening in Montreal, Guterres warned humanity has become a weapon of mass extinction and that it must change course. Now, many experts are calling the summit a final chance to save the world's species and ecosystems as we know them.
The bones of an elephant poached for its ivory in Kenya. Images like these serve as a very visible reminder of the threat that humans pose to animal and plant life. Deforestation, changes in land use, the climate crisis and pollution are also taking a big toll. About 1 million species are currently at risk of becoming extinct due to human activity. This not only threatens to degrade ecosystems further, but also endangers our own welfare.
We depend on biodiversity for the food we eat, the water we drink, the sequestration of carbon, the medicines we take. For instance, 70% of cancer drugs come from biodiversity or nature.
The UN Biodiversity Conference will center on how to protect 30% of land and sea by 2030. Scientists stress that this target is needed to prevent the collapse of ecosystems and human prosperity in the future.
The biggest threat is us human beings. And unless our relationship with nature changes, the situation will continue to deteriorate. I'm saying so because 97% of the global biodiversity is degraded as the result of human action.
We need to take urgent measures to protect ourselves from ourselves, experts argue, but who will cover the costs? Some emerging and developing economies, such as Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo, tend to be particularly rich in biodiversity. But these countries argue that they lack the resources to expand their conservation efforts. They are demanding financial support from richer nations.
We don't want to see a target which has absolutely no hope of implementation.
Scientists say there is no time to lose. However, even if the COP15 participants set an ambitious target, it can only be the beginning. None of the biodiversity objectives agreed at the 2010 convention have yet been fully implemented by the global community.
And Ajit Naranjan joins us now from our environment desk. He's been following this for us. There's so much at stake at this conference. Just walk us through what it is.
So ultimately, this conference is about stopping the destruction of the planet, of the life on this planet. And as we just heard in the report, we're a long way off actually achieving those goals. So, I mean, just to give a bit of context, the biggest scientific study of all the life on Earth found just a few years ago that nature is declining at unprecedented rates, and the rates at which we're pushing species to extinction is getting faster and faster and faster. And so the sort of things that this conference is the parties at this conference are trying to agree on are policies to do things like protecting 30% of the land and sea from human interference, doing things about the huge amounts of fossil fuel subsidies and other environmentally destructive subsidies that essentially taxpayers are using, governments are using taxpayer money to put into the destruction of the things that we rely on. And other policies include things like forcing big companies to disclose kind of the impact that they're having on nature.
Why should we care?
It's a good question, and it's one that I think scientists, when I talk to scientists about this, I also struggle to get a very clear answer. I mean, there's three ways I think you can look at it. On the very first level is that we pay for it. So we pay for it today in terms of things like when pollinators die and food prices rise and
like
crops
bees.
die.
Yeah.
Bees going, birds going. All of these things mean that we're actually directly suffering from the added costs that we don't see, we don't directly notice it, but it's happening there in the background. Mm-hmm. Second thing is that it could massively cause collapses of systems. So when we talk about things like climate change, we know things are getting worse and worse, and we know the more that we heat the planet, we know that the worse it gets. But with biodiversity loss and wildlife loss, it's on a whole nother level. The chances of just tipping an entire kind of ecosystem on which we rely to get good food, that has massive consequences. And so things like pandemics becoming more likely as we expand into untouched lands. Essentially, you can link things like lockdowns over pandemics, which we've just become very used to over the last few years, to things like the way that we treat nature. And I mean, the third thing, and I don't want to make a light of this, but what I read this morning was that pollinators for some crops are kind of not really necessary. So things like rice and stuff like that, maize, we can get by if we don't have birds and wild bees kind of pollinating things. With other crops, there's a bit of dependency. So fruit, nuts, avocados, things like that. But with chocolate is entirely dependent on wild pollinators. If you destroy nature, you don't have chocolate. And that's not just something that affects our kitchen and like our snack at lunch. It also means entire industries get collapsed.
Okay, so it really matters. So there's definitely a need for urgent action. Ajit Nurajan, I know you're following this further, so we'll get updates from you. Thank you so much.